Let's go, let's go, let's go. Welcome to the All Caps podcast, where we talk about everything and all things startup related. I'm Ahmed, but you can call me Ak.
And I'm Murph.
And today we got the go-to-market and venture king himself, Levi Reed. He was an ex-Amazon product marketing leader, current MD at the Founders Institute, as well as a venture partner at Loyal VC and Purpose Build, just to name a little few things that he's tapping into. So when we talk everything about products, Levi has seen it all. So thank you so much for being on the podcast. We're so stoked to have you. I want to say this, just kind of like to preface and get the audience kind of like our personal connection with Levi. What I love about you most, man, is like your brilliance and authenticity. When I first met you back at like school at the UW, like you were able to unpack everything at a whole nother level and a whole nother wavelength of thinking. So I just want to prop to you on that. And you're one of the mentors, he's one of our mentors for this podcast. And I want to say he breaks down the landscape like no other. And his love for teaching and putting people on is inspirational, and someone I aspire to have that same purpose. So I just wanted to say that before we got started, so people know how like goated, how crazy you are, and how caring and loving you are as well.
Thanks, man. Color I am, right? Be bright red right now. Appreciate it.
So, all right. So we know that you're the jack of all trades, and to give a little, the listeners a little chance to meet you, what would you call yourself when you introduce yourself to other people? For instance, like how I kind of I'm trying to do a Dungeons and Dragons reference, like the grand artificier of many wars. I really butchered that. I'm trying to I try to give a Dungeons and Dragons reference. But how do you introduce yourself? What do you call yourself? What do you say you do? Just to give everyone like a little breakdown.
Yeah, well, that kind of depends. If I'm introducing myself to somebody in startups around Seattle, I usually just say I work with startups. That's typically enough to get the conversation going. Outside of that group, depending on who I'm talking to, sometimes I'll just say something like fractional executive, or I'll just say I work in startup ecosystems in VC.
Okay.
I like to give that kind of an answer because then somebody can just say, "Oh, okay, that sounds nice," and now we can go talk about the weather or whatever. Or if, that hooks their attention, they say, "Wait, what does that mean?" Right? Which is a great question. Yeah. What does it mean? I'm still trying to figure out my elevator pitch, so that's about as far as I've gotten.
Okay. How did you fall into the startup world, and what made you stay in the startup game? So, like, what really attracted you to this kind of space?
Well, so I grew up. Both my parents are small business owners. So that got me going, right? And then I had, coming out of grad school, I had a small company. I started a marketing agency in my hometown. And doing that, I ended up working with a lot of startups. I got involved with a local, we called it a co-working space at the time. They might call it a startup studio now, something kind of halfway in the middle. Got to work with a bunch of really interesting companies there, some really interesting folks. And that's kind of actually what led me to go do my MBA. I thought I'd been working in the marketing side, and I really wanted to understand more about the fundamental business. So the school I went to, ESADE in Barcelona, really, really excellent MBA program. And they actually have a startup incubator literally in the same building as the MBA program, or at least it was when I was there. So I think it was 2 weeks after I landed on campus, I'd already landed an internship running marketing for one of the startups there. And then they paid for me to go to TechCrunch with them to do some PR in San Francisco. That was back in 2015. TechCrunch Disrupt, I mean. I think I was hooked from that point. It was just, I was having so much fun. It felt like I was just living in the future, right? These founders who are going, I'm building greenhouses to put on Mars, and I'm building lasers that are going to drive satellites. It's just like, what is even happening here? So I really just dived into that space when I moved to Seattle. Got involved in the ecosystem, ended up joining as a co-founder for a couple of other ventures, getting involved in VC. And what I'm kind of feeling now is just this is such a dynamic and interesting place to be at, right? We're at the cutting edge of technology and seeing what are going to be the defining companies and technologies of the next few decades. And we get to see them before anybody else if you're in the early stage startup space, especially if you're in deep tech. And then on top of that, getting to work with founders who are folks who are just the good kind of crazy, right? Like they really care about what they're doing. They're often not making a lot of money, or in some cases even paying to be able to do what they're doing. And they're a little off their rockers, right? Like you can't have a typical approach to risk and be a startup founder, I think. And working with folks who are that excited about what they're doing, that passionate about it, that brilliant, I think it's a real privilege. It's a lot of fun.
I mean, so to go, so you were talking about how you kind of were naturally, organically thrown into this space. I mean, what did you want to do when you grew up? This is like a little off topic, but like, and how do you think your younger self thinks that you're so, you're knees deep in the water of the startup world, and like just kind of to break the ice, get to know you further than just this VC world and stuff like that.
Well, I'm gonna sound like a giant nerd here, but so I didn't know what VC was until I was in my 20s. I didn't know what management consulting was. I remember a friend telling me that they'd landed a management consulting gig at EY right out of undergrad, which is a big deal now. It was a really big deal then. I didn't even know what EY was. I didn't know what management consulting was. Never heard of it. But I can remember when I was very young, I grew up on a farm in the middle of nowhere in upstate New York. And I remember when I was very young, my first visit to Manhattan, seeing the skyscrapers. And I just kind of fell in love with the financial district. I was just a little bit obsessed with that. And then I remember later, I think it was in college, I encountered the concept of a corporate raider, reading some case study about Carl Icahn or something like that. I can't remember. And I just thought this idea of the way that the strategic maneuverings at this corporate level in terms of acquisitions and mergers and hostile takeovers was just so fascinating. And I think that's what kind of hooked me into business. It was through this finance route, even though I do not have a background in finance and never have. It's just always been something I've been so curious about. And so I think what's really kind of pulled me into VC was that interest in kind of the financial underpinnings of how corporate America works, how business works. As far as what I wanted to be when I grew up, I don't know. I was a smartass as a kid, right? I figured out when I was about 7 or 8. People would ask me all the time, "What do you want to be when you grow up?" Well, my mom at that time, when I was that young, was still figuring out her future as an entrepreneur and hadn't even started the business that she runs now. My dad was a farmer, and the one thing he was very clear on is that my brother and I were not going to be farmers. We were very, very committed to this. So I didn't really have great examples of what to be, right?
Yeah.
So when I was 7 or 8 and people kept asking me, "What do you want to be when you grow up?" I started saying outrageously happy, because they didn't know whether I was joking or not, because I was like 7, right? And so they'd chuckle politely and then they'd stop asking me, which was what I was going for. So I don't know that I really had a specific career goal in that sense. I don't know that I do now, to be honest. I think in directions and options, not in hard goals and paths, I guess. So the thing that I learned early on in my career is that it's foolish to try to assess a career path or a job based on your external perspective of that career path or job, right? Things that look interesting and glamorous, often not so much. And my best example of this, I started my career in the wine industry, and I worked in vineyards. I became a winemaker. And a lot of that experience was frankly pretty miserable, due in part just to the day-to-day work, due to some of the people I had to work with, due to terrible pay. The majority of your time as a new winemaker is spent cleaning things. That's almost entirely what you do, is you clean things. So you tell people you're a winemaker, they go, "Oh, that's so," they're thinking these exotic, evenings tasting wine in the moonlight in the vineyard. You're washing tanks, and you're burning these horrific sulfur candles in barrels to sanitize them. It's just not, So then I left that last position, and I had an opportunity to join a government job in waste management, but it was an office role. And it's exactly what's supposed to be the worst of everything, right? It's I'm sitting in an office cubicle. I'm talking to people who think that the height of humor is saying, TGIF. And I loved it. Like, it was great, right? Like it was so much more calm and relaxing. I had my time back. I wasn't a slave to the weather. I was getting a steady paycheck. My day was just pleasant. It was more pleasant. It was calmer. And I realized, like, what I care more about is what does my lifestyle look like? What does my day look like? And are certain important, criteria being met? And if all the answers to all those questions, or most of those questions, is yes, I don't really care what the particular job is. It's more what am I getting out of it?
Yeah. I wanted to build upon your as a kid, you're like, I just want to be happy, So what do you want to be when you grow up? I just want to be happy. That's literally the same when growing up. I mean, at least like through high school and all that, I didn't know what I wanted to do. I grew up in an environment where I wasn't given a lot of guidance of like, this is what you should do. This is where there was like, I was just kind of like thrown in the deep end. They're like, my parents were like, hey, we just came to America. You're going to college. And it's like, that's the only goal I knew. But I would always, growing up, my uncle would always tell me something along the lines of being able to separate your kind of like who you are and separating your career is always an important thing. Cause I feel like there's always been, especially in the startup world, it's always been like, I am my company. And it's like, that could lead to, a lot of distress and stuff like that. And being able to kind of split up those two lives and be like, this is my personal life and this is my startup life. And being able to do that. Cause I know there's like hustle culture where it's like, oh, like you got to go 130%. I know you got to work hard in the startup world. Yeah. But I feel like being able to healthily like split these two worlds so that you can maintain sanity is important. And that's like a lesson that I kind of like pinpoint out of what you were saying.
I completely agree. And I think one of the dangers of something like hustle culture, like you said, right, it's important to work hard. But when you start to prioritize the intensity of your hard work over the outcomes of your work, you begin optimizing for the wrong thing, right? And what starts to feel beneficial or even virtuous, because we have a tendency as humans to moralize this, right, is that just complete exhaustion from spending yourself entirely and prioritizing your work above all else. But when you start to make that your goal, right, you're no longer optimizing for output or efficiency. You're optimizing for exhaustion. And that's very foolish. I don't think it's good at all. That's why I often say I really like working with lazy engineers, because, a lazy engineer is going to find a really interesting, creative way to solve a problem. I had a friend back in college who said there's nobody as creative or industrious as a pothead trying to find a place to smoke. And based on the friends I had in school, I have to agree. It was really remarkable. So, I think it's a question. There's a concept I really like. It's called, I think it's called Goodhart's Law. It's the idea that when a metric becomes a target, it ceases being useful for measurement, right? So I think an example of that I really like is you look at our public school system, and over the past few decades, how it's become heavily oriented around standardized testing scores, and these become the metrics of the measurement of success, right? In a school. But the problem is what you do when you incentivize reaching a particular target, you incentivize behaviors that optimize for that target. You're picking the target as a proxy for something else. You're using the test scores as a proxy for academic success and, ability to learn, whatever. But what happens is when you begin optimizing for those test scores is it's no longer a useful proxy, because the behavior that made it a useful proxy has now changed. Right, so that the situation isn't static. It doesn't stay the same, and so arguably that's detrimental to the end goal that you actually wanted of improving learning outcomes, because you're not optimizing for testing.
And like building, because like I have a little brother, so like and I should be hustling in school like I am telling my little brother to do, but I don't.
Well, I'm going to tell you something funny there, Ahmed, and I apologize for interrupting you, but just before you go on with the thought, there's a really interesting statistic for MBA programs that found that your GMAT score, right, the entry exam, is positively correlated with your grades in business school, in an MBA program specifically. So the higher your GMAT score, the higher your grades in the MBA program. But the interesting thing is there's a negative correlation, and a fairly strong one, between your grades in an MBA program and your earnings after the MBA program. In other words, people who got worse grades tend to have higher earnings. And the hypothesis I saw when I read this research a few years ago is that if you're putting too much time into your grades in an MBA program, which really is fundamentally about networking, you're not putting in the time in the networking, right? And the job applications. So if you get to the end and you've got a perfect GPA, but you haven't been putting any time into network building for your career, you've now got a period of unemployment before you find a job, and it's probably not going to be as good a job as you could have gotten if you networked your way in. So just an interesting point, right?
It's like why
are you doing what you're doing, right?
The A students work for the B students, and the B students work for the C students, and the C students run the corporation. That's a quote that I like and that I've heard that you just described well.
I think it can often be true, because I think if you look at our educational systems, they often, and I guess I'm a bit iconoclastic here. I had an unusual educational background, so take it with a grain of salt. But I think our educational systems are optimized really for, what's a good word? I don't want to say they're optimizing for a middle of the road outcome, right? The highest chance of an acceptable outcome in terms of career success or life success, right? I was going to say they optimize for mediocrity, which isn't precisely the nuance I wanted. but in that ballpark, right? But if you're talking about somebody doing something exceptional, then they need to be exceptional. They need to have some kind of an exceptional experience and perspective. And we don't currently have systems that really optimize for that. So as a case in point there, if you look at pretty much any one of the founders of the biggest tech companies in existence today, Amazon, Facebook, Microsoft, Apple, it's a long list. They're all Montessori school graduates, like all of them. Very few exceptions, and the few exceptions typically have other alternate backgrounds. But the thing that they have in common is all of the educational styles are didactic methods that are focused on encouraging learning and self-education, creative exploration. So I think that that's very, very important personally. And I don't think it's something you necessarily need to have in childhood, but it needs to be a state of mind that you can adopt if you practice innovation.
And I think it's being curious, like that's something that we talked about on our last episode. We were saying that like you don't have to have like a perfect idea. You don't have like a quote that we were like I'm not quoting it word for word. I'm doing the quick notes,
paraphrasing.
Paraphrasing. And pretty much what it said was, it's not that your first idea is going to be the next $1 billion idea that you have. In fact, that first idea allows you to fail and learn and be curious and learn from that experience to have generated new way of thinking and new way of thoughts, so that when you come to your second idea, that's the idea that has a better market fit. That's the idea where you have a little bit more traction, and so on and so on. It's kind of like throwing yourself into the deep end and getting that kind of generation of thoughts and thinking differently, allowing yourself have like a different experience and fall into different curiosities to kind of have a new way of thinking from these new experiences. I feel like really is like the success of successful ideas.
Yeah, I totally agree. You have to be able to change your perspective and adopt new points of view. I think the ability to learn is critical. And I mean, to your point, Ahmed, on average, successful startups pivot at least twice materially before finding product market fit. So one of the things I always like to say is going in at an early stage, if you're an investor looking to back a founder or a founder looking to make a hire or find a co-founder, the only thing you really know for sure is that 6 months down the road, everything's going to be different. So you don't really want to bring someone on board who has a very precise and therefore kind of brittle skill set, right? Very deep expertise in general, right? There are exceptions. You're a biotech firm or something. Obviously, you need very precise expertise in certain areas. But in general, when we're talking about operations, you really want to optimize for people who are adaptable and have the ability to learn, as opposed to having 20 years expertise in running HubSpot campaigns or whatever, right? Because everything's going to change. I think that's very, very important, and it's important to have in founders as well.
Yeah. Change is the only constant thing in life. So I think that's very prevalent when you're building a business.
Absolutely.
It's important to keep that in mind in the back of your head all the time. And, Levi, you definitely have an eye for like catching something to become hot in the market. And I think a big thing that when we asked like our listeners, like what they kind of wanted to hear, how do you know like an idea is worth pursuing? If you had to give your best guess, like a lot of our listeners, and even myself and Oxself, like it took us a while to get this podcast going. We procrastinated, and there's a quote that one of our professors told us is procrastination is based on the assumption that the opportunity does not have an expiration date. And, you just got to get out there and do it. So how do you know an idea is worth pursuing? How would you answer that?
I think my answer is going to be super boring.
That's okay.
I mean, I want to see the data, right? So basically the way I like to structure it, and this is not in any way radical or uncommon, but there's different methods, but this is how I like to structure it, is basically to work with a founder to understand what is kind of their case, right? You're selling this new product into this market. You believe that market is going to expand and you have an opportunity to disrupt an incumbent because of XYZ. Great. Build me the narrative, right? How does this work? What are the trends that you're seeing that lead you to believe this? And now let's identify in that narrative, what are the things that I, as an investor, need to believe that this is the true narrative? And how do we get data to back this up, right? And so then you kind of create some data points, right? So to give a sort of a high level example, I'm working with a company right now that makes plant-based leather sustainably created accessories, right? Fashion accessories, handbags, purses, things like that. And so part of the thesis that they're building this product line on is that we see a growing trend in younger generations of consumers that a stated preference for cruelty-free and sustainably sourced products in fashion. Now, I can look at that as an investor and say, okay, if that's true and that's where the market is going, great. But I happen to know that consumers have been saying that for ages, and it doesn't really matter. What consumers say they want to buy and what they'll actually buy, two very different things. So now I need you as the founder to convince me that something is different this time, right? That this is a believable narrative. Well, so that founder comes back with data that says, actually, here are some buying patterns. And when we look at buying patterns among millennials and Gen Z versus older generations, we're seeing a material change towards sustainable products. And the rate of that change is comparable to the rate of change in stated sentiment. So now we have actual behavioral data to link to our stated, preference data that backs it up. Now, when we plug that into our narrative, younger generations prefer this type of product. Larger brands aren't catching up fast enough. Ergo, there's a market opportunity. That narrative hangs together pretty well, right? So we created a story. We backed it up with data. Obviously, there's a lot more to it, but just as a simple example, that's kind of what it is. So the thing that I always really caution against is, this is a trap that I've seen a lot of new marketers fall into as well, is using yourself as an example, right? Yeah. So you say, well, I constantly have this problem, and I'm representative of my market, and therefore XYZ, right? I'm going to go build this thing. And marketers will do the same thing. So, well, this resonates with me and that doesn't. So I'm going to do it this way. That's a great guidepost to start to figure out your testing, right? You say, well, I have this problem and it's because I am X, Y, and Z. So step 2 is not to say, therefore everybody else must have this problem and I'm going to go build this product. Step 2 is to say, let me go find more people who match those same criteria and ask them some questions and figure out if my experience is generalizable. Whether you're a marketer or a founder building a new product or a product manager, this is what you ought to be doing. And then when you have those conversations and you talk to those people, you keep that conversation focused on them and their experience. How is this a problem for you? When was the last time it was a problem for you? What do you currently do to deal with this problem? How much does it cost you to deal with this problem? What are the pain points around this, right? What could be different here? What might be better for you? But always them. Don't suggest things, right? If they ask you about your product, you say, oh, I'd love to tell you about it, but I don't want to color your responses. Like, let me just ask some questions first, right? And what you're doing as the founder, your job is to take those answers and what you know about your product and say, okay, is my idea actually going to solve this problem? Is this a big enough problem that anybody's going to care? Are people currently spending enough time or money on this problem that I can price this at a level that's going to make my business solvent, right? And venture scale, right? But that's your job as the founder. Too many founders will go out, first-time founders, and they'll try to get the customer to answer those questions. Would you pay this much money? Would you use this product? Does this feature help you? No, they'll always say yes, right? Or almost always. But that's not behavior. That's just self-reported. There's a lot of different social pressures acting there. It's not an accurate representation of what they're going to do.
Yeah. I.e., or like example, you're pretty much saying, put your money where your mouth is, like we're like in the sense of if you're saying some statement, you got to bring up some data points to really back it up. But I was thinking about this while going,
absolutely.
Yeah. And like what I was thinking about this, like because me and Murph are kind of like different. Murph is very analytical and he can really break down something and organize something. I'm on the side of chaos where I will be like, hey, Murph, let's just do this idea. Let's do this. He's like, all right, well, is this something that people want us to do? Is there evidence that they do? And I'm like, let's just go do it. Let's just and it's like, I have no, I'm just like let's just ship. And that's why we're able to balance each other very well. Cause I need someone to help organize my thoughts and everything. And he's also crazy creative too. On top, he's like a dual wheel sword. But I want to say, how do you balance how do you balance analysis and this kind of like this shipping mentality, just go do it, to avoid this analysis paralysis? I feel like sometimes you can either, as a founder, you can fall to the side of, oh, okay, I need to make sure we have all these data points, all these kind of things, and you might miss an opportunity next to you. And there's some people that might just jive in and they waste all this time and they have no sort of data points that this is product market fit or this is what the customer want, and then they end up building something that's completely wrong. How do you balance those two kind of worlds?
Well, I think that's a really good question. At the end of the day, it's a judgment call. I mean, this is like the $1 million question, right? But I would say I'm going to say 3 points, and now let's see if I can remember all three of my points.
Okay.
One, I think it's really important to remember that this is not a static process, right? You'll come up with like I said, most successful startups, or on average, successful startups pivot twice, to the point where a lot of investors, myself included, will say, if you're going to market with the same idea that you originally had, something's wrong here. You didn't do your due diligence properly.
Mm-hmm.
Number two is thinking about what are the upside and downside risks that you're dealing with here, right? What is the cost of getting it wrong, and what is the opportunity of getting it right? Mm-hmm. So if the cost of getting it wrong is a couple of weeks going down the wrong hole, but the cost of getting it, or the benefit of getting it right, is product market fit and funding, I mean, yeah, do it. Take shots on goal, right?
Mm-hmm.
Go for it. But if every attempt is going to cost you half your funding and take 6 months, well, no. Now we've got a really high bar to clear for validation, right? We only get 1 or 2 shots on goal, so we need to make sure they count, right? So I think it's a question of balancing probability with risk, or with upside and downside potential. And then the last thing, which is related but subtly different, is the concept of, and this is one of my favorite concepts in decision making, but I think it's so critical but really underappreciated. It's the concept of a one-way versus a two-way door decision, or put another way, is the decision reversible or not? And I think it's very important to note that this is context dependent, right? The example I always like to use is, let's say you're launching a new marketing campaign, right? Or an advertising campaign, your Kraft macaroni and cheese. And you launch a marketing campaign that's pitching, I don't know, grape flavor or something. Cool. I mean, that's kind of a two-way door decision, right? If it doesn't really fly, it doesn't work, you pull it, whatever. But your Kraft macaroni and cheese, and you're pitching, and this is an actual campaign. If you didn't see it, they did it with Mischief and Company, which is hands down my favorite ad agency.
Yeah.
Studio, whatever they call themselves. They did their Send Nudes campaign, right? Very cheeky, wink, wink, nudge, nudge, right?
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah.
Emails, right? That's a one-way door decision, because that has potential brand impact. So you need to understand what the upside and downside risks are. You need to understand, how you're going to handle this and what your goals are. And you need to be pretty sure of it, right? Because if you're wrong, you could create a lot of damage for your brand. Now, let's say that you're I don't know, you're still you're an organic macaroni and cheese brand, and you're already really cheeky, right? And you do stuff like this all the time. You could run a Send Nudes campaign. Not going to be a big deal. Everybody's going to say, hey, whatever. That's just them. So I think that's important to think about. And then a fourth bonus point. Once you've decided what you're going to test, I think it's really important. I tell this to all my founders. It's a psychological thing, but it's really important, is establish what your success metric is up front. So I'm testing product market fit with this new product feature, whatever, and I'm running a pilot. I'm going to run it for 2 months. I'm measuring new user acquisition, number of interactions per day, and conversion to paid rates, right? And here are the thresholds I want for each of those to consider this successful. So at 2 months, if I haven't hit those thresholds, it's not successful, I throw it out. But I'm making the decision in advance. And the reason is because, especially when you're an early founder and everything is shifting and moving, it's very easy to talk yourself one way or another depending on how you're feeling that day. It's a massive cognitive load. If you set yourself a rule in advance when you sit down and you evaluate the experiment, why you're doing it, and you can tie that back to what the benefits or costs are, you make it very simple for yourself. You either hit the threshold or you don't. And if you're trending to not hit the threshold, you can start spinning up your next experiment before you've even finished, right? Now, it's a self-imposed rule. You could get to the end and be like, ooh, we're like 2 points below, but all of a sudden it's been trending up the last 2 weeks. So I technically didn't hit my threshold, but I think we figured out what went wrong. We can run with it. Cool, run with it, right? Nobody's telling you can't. But just knowing what you're going to track and what you're targeting with those things that you're tracking in advance can be really, really valuable.
And to bring up the Kraft mac and cheese, I made a one-way door decision in high school when I was running for like the student body, and I decided to do that same kind of like the Send Nudes style, but I said send votes. I kept it school like appropriate, but the principal definitely knew where I was hinting at, and I definitely got in trouble, and I got that one-way door. I got really hit with the one-way door or like they disciplined me for that. So I remember I did that in front of like it was a video broadcast to the whole school, and they didn't know it was off script. So that's kind of my my one door decision that really did not help me when I was running for student body in high school.
Well, I'm going to declare that very entrepreneurial. I like it a lot.
Yeah, I was against the grain. I like that too, Hawk. You should have won.
I did win. I did win. I won the students' hearts. I did not win the office's hearts. They were not very happy with me, and I spent a lot of time writing I will not do that again in the office. So they taught me, but high risk, high reward scenario. But
there you go, right? Now, it's really important though is looking back, and this is another thing I think a lot of people miss with decisions. There's actually a great book on this called Thinking in Bets by Annie Duke. I love this book. She's a former professional poker player. And her point is, when you're looking back and evaluating those decisions, when you evaluate your decision quality, so many times if we're not careful, what we're actually doing is evaluating the decision outcome, right? Mm-hmm. Now, if you look back and let's say you estimated, well, my positive outcome was this, but my negative outcome would have been catastrophic, and I only had a 5% chance of a positive outcome, and then you got the positive outcome, you might be tempted to say, oh, that was a good decision. No, it wasn't. That was a terrible decision. If you had a 95% chance of an abysmal outcome and only a 5% chance of an okay outcome, that's a terrible choice to make. It just had a good outcome because you happened to get that 5%, right? But it's really important, I think, to recognize that. And it's more important typically for the inverse, which is that you make the right decision and you get the wrong outcome, right? But there's always some risk involved. There's always some chance. And if you go back and you say, well, practice the discipline. Would you have made the same decision knowing what you knew then? Maybe you wouldn't knowing what you know now, but knowing what you knew then, was it the right decision, right? And often what you may find is, yeah, it was. It had a bad outcome. That's unfortunate, but it was still the right decision. Right. So outcomes and decisions quality are two different things. They're related, but they're not guaranteed to be causal. Right. This is a soapbox I stand on.
I'm personally like the poker, the risk with poker. Like, I don't like playing poker because there is a lot of risk. And, I think that's like a flaw that I have. I like to be analytical in all the decisions I make when I'm pursuing something. And then I'll go for it. I like to account for every possible transaction that could occur. And I love the one-way door, two-way door analogy. And like, I'm trying to use it in my life with all of my decisions. But I guess, like what would your biggest advice be for somebody, obviously they have this like making decision, two-way, one-way door analogy in their head. What's your biggest advice for like someone to just start and get their idea out there? Like, starting if they have nothing, like if they're a student, 20, 21 years old, what do you think is your best advice for somebody? How do they get those first couple of customers?
I think it's back to what we were talking about earlier with customer discovery. It's figuring out, who do you think you're solving a problem for, and what is the problem that you think you're solving, right? That's the first thing. You can do that with online research and just conceptually think it through. If you have an idea for a thing that you think needs to be in the world, it can be framed as a problem to be solved, work to be done, however you want to frame it, right? So once you know that, now you need to go start finding people who match that profile and asking them about that problem. Again, not about the solution, but about the problem. And that's the most important thing. And when you have those initial conversations and you ask about the problem, you start to get to a point where you begin to understand much more deeply what the situation is, what the problem you're solving is. And you understand the problems being experienced, the frustration being experienced by those people that you're trying to solve the problem for. And you understand the language that they're using to discuss and comprehend that situation, all of which are really important. So now you get to a point where you've started to build those connections by talking to these people. You've started to build trust, especially with the later conversations, because not only have you expressed an interest in something that they're negative that they're dealing with, presumably, which is a great way to start to build a rapport, but you're also coming to them with some existing understanding of their situation, which builds a lot of empathy and trust, right? So now you're really well informed to go look at customers, and almost guaranteed, if you've done a good job of it, some of those people you talk to are going to be some of those first customers, right? So in terms of how to build what you're going to offer, that really depends on what it is you're building. If you're doing an app or something like that, even if you're not an engineer, there's a lot of low code and no code tools out there that you can use. And with generative AI increasing in popularity, obviously there's a lot of options there. Yes, you're going to have to teach yourself things. Yes, it's going to be hard, but this is why if you talk to anyone in early stage venture, they don't care about ideas. They don't care about your idea. They don't care about NDAs. Early stage investors are not going to sign an NDA. And a lot of times this takes back some younger first time newer entrepreneurs, because we're often given this narrative that, you know, these ideas have their IP, they're super secret, they have to be kept safe or someone will steal your idea. But people who actually work in an early stage venture know the idea is basically worthless. It's the execution that matters, right? Whatever idea you've had, you're not the first person to have that idea, but the way you go about building it, if you go about building it, that's what makes it stand out. That's what makes it unique, right? That's the hard part. So don't be precious about your idea. Share it broadly and widely, right? Talk to people, understand, validate that there's a pain point here. Answer the 3 really important questions. Have you identified an actual problem? Is your solution actually solving that problem? And is solving this problem economically viable? Can you build a venture scale company out of it? Can you build any company out of it? If it's not venture scale, fine. Can you bootstrap it? Can you build a small business, right? But I think most important thing is most first time founders tend to jump straight to, how do I build this product? When the truth is, the very first step, the most important first step is, do I even need to build this product? Is there anybody who's going to buy this product? Right.
No, I mean, lately we've been, for me, I guess on my feed on Twitter, I've been seeing a lot of people building in public, and that's been kind of like a new methodology of building at early stage, of just walking through the whole process of everything, the pivots, the decision making, just writing, it's almost like a blog about all of the decisions you're making. You're allowing people to react with you. And this kind of comes into like, what I really like, and we talked about this before previously, not recorded, but I think that's like where like the new game is at, where it's of like building an audience early on in venture, like when you have your venture, and it's like that community building, like that being a lost art, or not even an art in the startup world yet, you know, like it's not I really think community building and this aspect of building in public and having people be connected with you and trying your product and seeing, and they fall in love with the humanized version of the brand, is what really is carrying these people from the no man's land of no traction to eventually having a business that's viable and has a lot of traction and is now growing organically to the right customers. I mean, what do you think about that? What do you think about building in public, that community-based like building and all that? Just kind of get your thoughts about that.
I completely agree with you. It's absolutely a growing trend. I'm here for it. I think it's really cool. I will say, I think we're going to get to a point, and I don't know exactly what this will look like, but within a couple of years, we're going to get to a point where it becomes really oversaturated and overdone, and it's not going to be as interesting anymore. But right now, it's still a novel concept. It's pretty cool. And because there aren't as many people doing it, and I will say, and this is purely my own impression, so I could be completely off base here, but it seems to me that it's particularly more popular among younger entrepreneurs. So a lot of like Gen Z folks I'm seeing doing this more. And I really like it. I think that it sets you up quite well as a founder, because you're building a personal brand, you're building those connections right off the bat, and you're displaying a level of transparency that allows, assuming that you really are transparent, you're sharing a lot of detail here, it allows an investor to really get a solid idea of who you are as a founder, before even interacting with you necessarily, right? Which is, I think, really appealing. It builds a lot of validation, I would say, and you know, pulls in people to help and people who are interested. I think it's super cool. I'm a big fan, but like I said, we'll get to a point where the practice is overdone and it's not as useful.
Yeah. And it'll get almost like annoying to a certain extent, I guess. I don't know. I can totally see that happening too. And before we move on,
really polished.
Before we move on, like we've been talking a lot of product, but I've been personally, you know, Ak is so product focused. I wish I had my mind networked and wired like his, but I've loved working with people. And, you know, you, Levi, you work with a lot of people across the world, different cultures, people from different backgrounds. I'm just curious, you know, when you're working with that many different people and you're also getting introduced to a lot of new individuals, what's kind of like a character trait that you look for that boosts like your confidence in a partnership, if you're going in a partnership with them, whether it's a founder or another investor or just anybody in general? I'd like to get your perspective on that because, you know, as me and Ak grow this out, we're going to be, you know, meeting with a lot of new people. And that's just part of the game. When you're trying to build a business, you need a lot of support people behind your back to help you. I'm just curious, like, what's a good trait that you like to look for when you're meeting somebody new?
That's a really good question. I don't know that I've ever been asked that before. I like that a lot. So I think there's a couple things I look for in terms of professional competency. There's two things I really like to see. One is just an overall curiosity and ability to learn. I firmly believe, I've written some diatribes on this. I firmly believe that the skill of learning new skills is in itself a skill that can be developed and improved, right? Understanding how you acquire knowledge in a new space and develop competency quickly, you can have a playbook for that. You can have a system for it. And I like to see that people have that, right? And that they have very strongly a growth mindset in most areas of their life, not a fixed mindset. The other thing that I like to look for is a capacity to go really deep on things. I don't care what those things are. They don't need to be work related. But what I'm looking for, what I really appreciate is somebody who can just 100% geek out on something. Again, doesn't have to be professional, doesn't matter, but the ability to just learn everything there is to know about something really fast and just develop that level of just kind of obsession. It's a personality trait that I really like. And then the other thing that's one of the biggest things, and this is true in my personal life and my professional life, it's going to sound a little cheesy, but I really stand by this, is just genuine kindness as a fundamental quality of that person. I think that unfortunately, the way that our economic systems tend to work and our financial systems tend to work is that we're rewarded for antisocial behavior, right? There's a lot of things that are immoral and unethical and just generally not cool, that functionally will yield you success, professional success, right? In a conventional sense. I think it'll also make you a miserable person, but I don't like those people. I don't want to work with those people. I don't want to be one of those people. I don't think I'm physically capable of being one of those people. Maybe I would see more professional success if I would, maybe not, but it's kind of a moot point. I'm not trying to virtue signal here. It's just not something, I can't behave that way. That's not who I am. I don't like working with people who will throw other people under the bus or belittle others or, scream and curse in professional situations or use fear as a management tactic. Not for me. And so I'm really looking for people who are not going to, you don't see standing in a room and justifying a terrible action because it's just business or they were doing what they were told, right? Think for yourself, have some autonomy, recognize that you're responsible for your actions, demonstrate some kindness and compassion. And ideally, I like to see people who are motivated, at least in part, by the positive impact that their work can have on other living things, whether those are people or animals. So that's very important to me personally. I think at the end of the day, any organization, any company ultimately exists to make somebody's life better. That might just be the owner who's getting a lot of money out of it. But I like to work in organizations and for people for whom the focus on whose life is being improved is a little bit broader, right?
I agree. And I wanted to, as we wind down with time, you kind of talked about the industries that you don't like so much, but we're curious what industries you do think are, heating up a little bit. Not investment advice, but, just industries that you're looking in right now. What are those industries that you think, businesses there's a gap there and there could be a creation that could see that gap and build upon it?
Well, everybody's really hot on climate tech right now. Justifiably, I think. I don't know that it still makes sense to refer to that as a monolith, though. I think there's so many developments in the space that are really just drastically different, right? Battery technology is not the same as ag technology, is not the same as, new energy generation is not the same as new materials development. These are different concepts. I'm personally really interested right now in new materials, particularly for CPG products, especially in fashion, textiles, that kind of thing, in terms of where it intersects with sustainability. Sustainability as a term, I think, contains kind of two or three concepts in it. One is technology that addresses the climate crisis. One is technology that addresses the environmental crisis. And one is technology that addresses just overly profligate use of resources, which can connect to either of those two issues. I do think that it's valuable if you're going to be talking about clean tech or climate tech to distinguish between addressing environmental issues versus climate issues. Obviously, climate is an environmental issue, but what I mean is the distinction I'm drawing is things that, for example, we talk about destruction of biodiversity and natural habitats, loss of or depletion of natural resources, problems with waste and pollution, right? Polluted water and air, or microplastics and everything, this kind of thing. I put that in the bucket of environmental crisis. Whereas climate crisis can be things like, CO2 and greenhouse gases, which aren't often typically harmful in and of themselves, except insofar as they contribute to the climate crisis. So too closely related, but still, I would argue, distinct concepts with distinct ideas and technology addressing them. I think there is a tendency to undervalue consumer products or consumer business models, I should say. I think that there's a lot of room for venture scale growth there and some really interesting and exciting companies. A lot of investors really kind of prefer to stick with B2B models, and especially software. I mean, early stage investment software is the most common space for sure. There's a lot happening in healthcare and biotech that's very interesting, but I think you do need some specialized knowledge to be successful there, particularly biotech. You see a lot of business models there that have additional complexity because it's not just about market risk and revenue model risk, but you're also looking at insurance coverage, you're looking at regulatory risk, and then there's all kinds of just weirdness about the healthcare market. And then when you look at stuff like biotech and new drug development, it's very extremely high risk because you have really long lead times in development. And then you have an even more binary value proposition than in venture as a whole, where if a company's developing a new drug, for example, if it's going through clinical trials and it's not doing anything, there's no validity there, you're left with literally nothing, right? It's either billions of dollars or nothing at all, and there isn't really much of an in between. So with things like biotech and models that are like that, I think it's really important to go in with enough capital to take advantage of the law of large numbers and make sure you're going to get a positive return, and enough knowledge to make sure that you're able to make the picks that tilt the odds in your favor enough so that you make money. I think I would say in terms of areas that I think are showing some really exciting, the point I was going to get to earlier, if we break down like climate and clean tech, I think ag tech in particular, I think that's a space that's very, very interesting. And that it's a little bit misleading to say that because ag tech encompasses business models and products that could be, chemical, deep tech, they could be software, hardware, robotics. We could be talking about management of farms versus management of crops, versus optimizing livestock. We could be talking about, different types of chemical products, feed products. So it's a lot, I think, that's encompassed there. I mean, health genetic technology as well is encompassed there. There's a lot involved in that space, but I think it's a very interesting space because we're seeing more and more food pressures, and particularly in the U.S. and North America, we're seeing changing dynamics in the labor force that make it much more economically attractive to bring robotics and automation to industries and verticals that previously relied heavily on often illegal labor or by illegal, I shouldn't say illegal, but exploited immigrant labor. I think many people don't realize the extent to which our agricultural economy in the United States is dependent, and I don't mean makes use of, but I mean is dependent on the exploitation of immigrant labor. There are entire industries that effectively would not be able to function without it, or verticals maybe is a better term. And also, I feel like the exploitation of disabled persons is another big one. If you look at slaughter industry, for example, slaughterhouses and abattoirs staffed extremely high percentages of folks with different types of physical and developmental disabilities, who are often treated in truly horrific ways. During the pandemic, and I would strongly encourage you, if you don't believe me, fact check this. During the pandemic, OSHA refused for a period of time to do inspections in slaughterhouses around Chicago because based on the self-reporting of those slaughterhouses, they said that the conditions were acceptable for the workers, but the conditions did not meet OSHA's own safety standards for their inspectors. And so there's some really remarkable political language from one of the Stevens in the Trump administration. I forget if it's Miller or Nukin, but or Nuchin, however you say his name. One of them, some really interesting language where they're effectively conveying that the conditions are unsuitable for the ocean inspectors, but considered suitable for the workers who are actually working there. Really remarkable stuff.
Yeah, that's a little bit frightening. I don't know, but I feel like it has a lot to do with like the lack of knowledge there, and you know how things can be misinterpreted has to do with the language and how it's sort of marketed. You know, the difference between climate tech and ag tech. There's so many different niches when you narrow it down.
Yes,
and I feel like that lack of language and being detailed, I don't know. I think it does tend to confuse people about spaces that need more eyes on that space, totally and more support. So
you can see that in healthcare, for example, right? There's a whole segment of startups in healthcare called femtech, right? So healthcare for women, basically. But it's kind of remarkable, and it's often treated and explicitly called a niche market, right, by investors and others. But you know, it's addressing issues that affect over half the population.
Yeah.
Right? Like slightly more than half, 51% of the population.
I was curious about the niche. Like, what's so niche that's 50% of the...
Right.
Like,
but it's bonkers when you look at the data points behind this. I mean, there are so many entrepreneurs out there in women-focused healthcare building solutions for medical hardware, medical processes, diagnostic procedures that haven't changed in 50, 60, 80, 100 years, literally, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's just mad. And then when you look at the background of legislation around including women in clinical trials, in healthcare trials, it's absolutely insane. It was just what was it? It was like in the early 90s, I think it was, that legislation was passed requiring certain percentages of women women of childbearing age to be included in clinical trials. So there's all kinds of standard practice out there, medications, processes, procedures that are prescribed for women where we don't actually have any clinical data on whether or not these procedures are relevant for women or behave differently for women, right? Medication behaves differently for women. It's the examples out there. Some of them are almost unbelievable. I was talking to one investor in the space who was telling me how apparently the standard test for whether or not you're having a heart attack in a hospital involves checking for a particular, I don't know if it's an enzyme or a hormone in your bloodstream. But apparently women don't actually produce that during a heart attack. It's not a valid diagnostic procedure for women. But this is so poorly understood that it's quite common for women to be misdiagnosed as having, I don't know, hysteria, as long as we're in the Victorian era, instead of an actual heart attack, and then they die because they aren't correctly diagnosed in the emergency room. Just stuff like that. It's really wild. But you know, you see it come all the way back to the early stage of investing, where investors are talking about addressing these kinds of issues as solving for a niche market, and they don't want to invest. Right? It's wild.
Yeah. What were you gonna say about that, Murph?
I just wanted to, so, you know, obviously you understand these industries that you just listed off, and, you know, some unknown details to them pretty well. And, you know, I think that's something that I struggle with when I'm, well, you understand it better than me. So I'm curious, how do you conduct research when you're looking into a market that you like, for example, sustainability and textiles, like that's pretty niche, you know, and I totally feel you. Like, consumer products, those are always going to be around. I would like looking into that market more myself. But like, how do you conduct your research to know if you really like something? Is it talking to people? Yeah. You know, is it doing a simple like Crunchbase or PitchBook search? I'm curious, like what? Ask that. I'm curious, like if you use any platforms, do you just talk to people? Do you listen to the news? I don't know. How do you like to list your thoughts on certain markets?
Well, if I'm diving into a new topic, and this really holds true for anything that I'm trying to learn about quickly, there's basically three things that I do more or less simultaneously. I try to identify people that I am connected to or can get connected to who know things about the space that can tell me, you know, when I talk with them, I'm looking for like nodes of interest. What are some things where I can get a cluster of words, a concept, an entity, an organization that I can dive into and use that as kind of a pathway to lead to more more things to get a sort of a mental map of the space that I'm trying to learn. And then in preparation for those conversations, I look for two types of things in the space. I look for the unique language that's used around the topic and understanding that language so that I can speak it and understand it when I talk to the person. And I look for the points of contention in the space. Where are there areas of disagreement or tension of some kind, right? Where is there debate? And often when you look for a point of debate and you dive into that debate and inform yourself on both sides so that you can understand the arguments, the case, and develop an opinion, the goal being to develop an opinion. It gives you sort of almost a pre-developed structure for how to learn about the topic, because now you're trying to construct an argument to inform an opinion. Okay, what do I need to construct that argument? Well, I need to know what these things mean. I need to know the data points over here. I need to know the history of this concept. I now have a curriculum, right? In the course of doing that, I'm looking for the unique words, concepts, and jargon. What are the things that are so generally assumed to be true that they're taken for granted, often almost to the point of joking? What are unique terminology concepts that are used? What are references to historical events that are germane to the topic? And in any discipline, you'll often notice words that they're not exactly jargon, but they're maybe less common vocabulary that's more commonly used in that space, right? And so you want to kind of look for that too. And then when I go and I talk to those people, I'm trying to give them an impression by the correct use of that language in reference to those different touchstones, debates, events, whatever. A sense that I put in some effort and I have some understanding of the space. And my experience is usually what happens there is that person starts to express their opinions on things as opposed to trying to educate me, right? And starts discussing in a more relaxed way using the language that comes naturally to them, the topics that are of interest to them in the space. Now we're having a much more interesting conversation. It's a two-way conversation, and I'm getting to pick up on the things that are being mentioned and the things that are not being mentioned, which will help me direct where I want to dive into a little bit deeper. And then at the end of that conversation, I can tell that person what I'm interested in, what I learned, ask any questions I had, and get them to direct me to a few other people that are maybe even more precisely related to wherever I want to go a little deeper. And then I basically have the same conversation with those people. That method can get you up to speed in a new topic to a point where you can have an intelligent conversation with an expert in the space very, very quickly. It's really dependent only on how many meetings you can get with the right folks. So that's usually how I like to do it. That's how I get started. And then from there, if I'm really going deep, now maybe I'll start researching more. I might get a book on the topic. If I'm going really, really deep, I'm going to try and get a job in the space. Done that before. It really depends on how far in I want to go. Or if it's something I can do for myself, I'm going to start trying to do it for myself. I wanted to learn about, alternative cultivation and indoor farming and growing and stuff like that. So I got myself a hydroponics tower. I've got a hydroponics garden upstairs. I've been learning how to work with that.
I love those.
That is really fun. I like it a lot, right? So stuff like that. So it depends on how deep you want to go.
Your way of researching is so much more sexier than what I would have said if I answered this question. Like, I would have if I were to say this, I'd be like, have you ever seen the Wikipedia, like the rabbit hole Wikipedia, where you just click all the hyperlinks and see where it takes you?
Yes.
I just do that, but on TechCrunch or any other blog, and I just fall into that rabbit hole, and I'm like. And I was like, all right, that was the research for the day. I feel like I'm decently educated.
Yeah.
Start to get a feel for like the kind of note, the things, the little details that you want to pull out and then sort of drop in those conversations, because it creates different reactions. When people, you'll mention some really obscure little fact, they'll go, oh, and you can see the wheels turn. They go, well, if you know that, what else do you know, right? And now you're having a really very different conversation. So I just find it really helpful in that respect.
No, yeah. I mean, I tried it with the crypto space. I was trying so hard to understand what was going on in it and stuff like that. Just because it was like cool buzzword going around at that time. But the deeper I got, the more lost I got. That was the first topic where I was like, I had no idea where this was going. Okay, so I know we want to be respectful of your time, and we wanted to, get some of the audience's questions out there. And we have one from Iad, and he kind of wanted to be like, who do you trust when, talking about your ideas? Do you trust your friends and family? And, when it's time to pivot, who do you talk to evaluate, this is the time to pivot, or do you more rely on the data set that's going forth? Because I know there's some more, there's more like mental health things that come into play, but also, how do you think about those? I hope I answered his question correctly, or asked his question. Asked his question correctly.
To the first point, I would say I would encourage kind of moving out of that mindset of being precious with the idea and thinking carefully about who you can trust with it. Like I was saying earlier, the idea isn't really what has value, right? Now, I mean, there's some distinctions here. Let's say you're a PhD and you've discovered some new compound that does magical, miraculous things, right? Maybe you don't share what the compound is, right? That seems like it's probably pretty proprietary. Obviously, you're going to build a company around it. You're going to get a patent on that or what have you. But sharing the fact that, hey, I've discovered this new compound that does magical, mysterious things, and I'm going to go build a company around it, that's fine, right? That's your idea. That's what you're going to do. Ultimately, if you're precious with your idea, you have to tell investors that they can't invest in you. Try to get them to sign an NDA, they're going to laugh in your face. Don't do that. And you have to tell potential customers, who could also be potential competitors, I suppose, because if you don't tell the potential customers, you can't really ask them for that input. You can't get people to try out the concept. So it's not about the idea; it's about the execution. So my encouragement would just broadly be talk to someone who's founded a company previously, and they're going to tell you the same thing. And take it from them. Don't take it from me, right? Somebody who's been there and done that. So don't be precious about the idea. And then I'm sorry, I forgot what the second part was.
The second one was like, how do you know when it's time to pivot, and who do you talk to when you're trying to make this decision, and telling you, and I think he was itching more at the mental health side of it. It's like, who do you talk to? How do you make that decision? Because this is your baby at the end of the day. How do you know, like, I know I have to cut ties with this idea. I need to go to this segment.
Well, I mean, I would encourage thinking about that right from the start and thinking about, okay, how much runway do I have to test this concept, and what am I looking to validate, right? And so I kind of would advise going in with the plan to pivot, basically, and figure out what you're trying to do with your first iteration is figure out where you pivot to and when, right? So you might go in and you say, okay, I've got 6 months of runway. So for the first 3 months, I got to figure out what the hell I'm doing. I'm really confident that I've identified a market and I've identified the right problem, but I'm not confident my solution is actually going to be the right solution. Okay, what do I need to test to be confident for that? What is my success threshold? Now I'm going to go do that. I'm 2.5 months in. I'm not trending the right way. What have I learned along the way? And how does that inform my idea of pivot, right? So having intentionality from as early on as possible so that you're not being reactive, but instead you are planning for the information you need and making a decision that you've essentially already defined. If I learn this, I'm doing A, and if I learn that, I'm doing B, whatever, right? The greater the degree to which you can do that, the better off you're going to be. It's also going to help from a mental health perspective. I think the mental health question, nobody can answer that but yourself. Some people have a higher risk tolerance, some don't. And it's important to be honest about your finances. And it's important to be honest about the fact that we talked about shots on goal being an important concept earlier.
Yeah.
That's important within the company, but it's also important within the context of your career as an entrepreneur. This company is in and of itself one shot on goal. Do not burn yourself out on one company. And I mean that both physically, mentally, and emotionally, and financially, right? I see some people occasionally, and I won't work with founders who do this because it stresses me out too much, who will, take out a second mortgage on their home or things just really high degree of risk.
That stresses me
out. Stuff that
you
should only do if you've got maybe like a 90% success rate. But if you're at a point where you've got a 5% chance of success, please do not be using your child's college funds or whatever. That's just a terrible idea. That's gambling.
Yeah.
So, I'm really, avoid doing that. The thing I would say in terms of who to talk to, again, this really depends, but here's the model that I like to think of to balance things out. I think that when you have mentors and advisors for your company, I like to put them on a spectrum that goes from cheerleader to critic. The cheerleader end of the spectrum are the investors or the mentors, or investors who are going to say yes and. They're going to get excited because you're excited. They're going to see the opportunity, or they're going to make themselves see the opportunity, and they're gonna want to add to it. They're going to boost you, support you, right? Then on the critic side, you have the people who are going to support you, and this is just assuming goodwill on everyone's front. You also have assholes. Don't talk to the assholes, right? These are not the assholes. So the critics are the people who, in their way of supporting you, is to poke the holes, to find the weak points, to say, well, have you thought about this? What if that fails? Why do you believe this is going to be successful? What's the evidence behind it, right? That's more discouraging, but it's necessary. It's also necessary. In my experience, the founders, tend to index a little too heavily one side or the other, and maybe counterintuitively, they tend to index on the critic side a little bit too much, in my opinion. They look for people who are going to poke all those holes. Now that's good to have that. That's useful. But the problem when you're only addressing weaknesses and potential failures is you're never taking advantages of strengths and exciting opportunities. So if all you're doing is focusing on the risks and failure and addressing those and mitigating those, you can never be better than mediocre. You're never taking the shot that you need to be exceptional. And that, I think, is where you need the cheerleader perspective, right? To help you find those strengths, those things where you're exceptional, the things where you're really doing something out of the ordinary or have the opportunity to, and you can take that shot and go for it. So you want to find that balance. And when you're talking to people, when you're picking out your panel of advisors and mentors, formally or informally, my advice is find people who kind of orbit sort of the middle half of that spectrum, right? You don't want too extreme, but you want a good balance of folks. So you've got some folks saying you're doing a great job and this is a really cool thing you're building and go do it. And somebody else who's saying, okay, but if that fails, what's your plan B? You know?
No, I think like you were saying, the cheerleaders aspect is important because it helps with morale, honestly. Like even, you know, I think you need a balance of both where it's like one person, you know, because there's times when building a startup, or at least when I build, like I haven't got to the stage of like building a venture backed startup, but when I build these like little indie projects, there's times where there's just no traction and I have no motivation to keep building. And I'm like, but you need some sort of, you know, either, you know, a deeper why to keep letting you go, or, you know, having also an external help to be like, hey, I see the opportunity, I see the vision, do this and maybe think about this. You know, rather than someone being like, this sucks, this is not good, this is, you know, because it's a brutal process.
It is. I, as an advisor, I'm very much on the cheerleader end of the spectrum, and I'm very open with founders about this, right? Because I go, look, don't take my enthusiasm as validation that you're on the right track, but instead use me to understand where your strengths are, right? And to keep your morale up. I've had founders literally break down in tears while we're on a call because they've just had a shitty week and they're really discouraged. And I say, look at what you've managed to accomplish over the past week. Yes, it's hard. There's going to be tough weeks, but this thing you did was really exceptional, right? And that's what they need to hear in the moment, right? But other times they come to me and they go, something's not working. I can't figure this out. And I'm looking for these weak points. Is this a good idea, right? I go, here's what I love about it. But you're looking for somebody who's going to come in with a more critical lens, right? I'm already excited. I'm sold on this project. And so the hardest I try, I'm still not necessarily going to be the best person to look at it from a point of view of like, I think this is going to fail. How's it going to fail? Right? Which is, you do need some degree of that pessimism, because if you've got someone in there, I'm looking at it and saying, this is going to succeed. How will it succeed? Right? You need to look at it from the point of view of, if this was going to fail, what's going to be the thing that kills it? Right. And I can do that sometimes. Sometimes it's obvious, but I don't have confidence that I'm the best person for that in most situations. You know, so there's absolutely value to both. But I think one thing that's really valuable too that often gets overlooked is that, you know, any company, any person is going to have some kinds of strengths. Some of those strengths will be relative to their other characteristics. Some of those strengths are going to be in more absolute terms. And so frequently, you know, I have one founder I'm working with, for example, who just put together just an incredible pitch deck. Like, the amount of information that she had, the amount of supporting information, the way she constructed her narrative. She's raising her first ever round. And this deck could go toe to toe with a Series A round, in my opinion, in terms of just general quality and a compelling narrative. She had no idea because she doesn't work with other founders, right? She doesn't really know. She's a first time founder. And so we're walking through it and I'm saying, hey, you know, there's a little too much detail here. And, you know, I think that your deck focuses a little bit too much on the social impact stuff as opposed to the profitability stuff. You need a good balance because this is a for-profit company and you're seeking investment. But you should also know, like, this is I see a lot of decks at this stage. And this is like top 5% for me. Like, really good. And here's why. Here are the specific things. She can't know that. I see 100 decks a year. She hardly sees any, right? So I can look at this and say, this is why it's exceptional. And here's the framework, the comparison points that I have. So now she can go into that meeting knowing, like, probably this is going to be a really amazing deck that the investors aren't, you know, they won't have seen a deck this great. That helps her figure out where she needs to prepare, right? How does she use that deck as effectively as possible? How does she lean on those points in the narrative that she now knows are unusual for a pre-seed company to have, right? These points of validation. For example, she's made revenue, like quite a lot of revenue, and she's hardly raised any money and had no formal round. She didn't know how rare that was, right? How unusual that is. So I'm like, lean on that in your narrative. That's enormous. That's so valuable. So that's where that kind of value comes in. Knowing what your strengths are means you can play to them, and playing to your strengths is the only way to be exceptional.
And so, kind of to build on that, you were talking about first-time founders struggling to find people to talk to about these kind of things. I mean, what are some of your recommendations to build that community of other founders to have people to talk to? Because, again, I remember last time we talked, it was like we talked about loneliness being a big thing in this kind of like the startup ecosystem, just feeling like there's no one there to kind of like back you up or help you or support you. And there's other people that may think otherwise, you know, when they get into communities like Techstars, YC, maybe a different story. But how can first time founders build that community? Like, what are some recommendations you have for that?
Well, I think a lot of it is leveraging your network and bringing together those mentors and advisors, right? If you're in an area with a lot of startups like Seattle or the Valley, right, you find the groups. There's always groups. Find groups that are in your niche, in your space. But understand what you're using them for. You're using them for validation, for social engagement, for, you know, just general, like, to be around other like-minded people. That's 100% fine. It's necessary. But just know that, right? Are you using them for education? Are you using them for something else? I also think that, you know, it's also really important for founders to do their best to have, you know, a healthy lifestyle outside of their work as well. And so maybe that founder doesn't really need other founders to work with or to engage with, because they've got, you know, a supportive spouse and a strong friend group, and they're doing social activities periodically with those friends, and they've got a great social life. So it's not really that lonely, because maybe their work is kind of lonely, but their life isn't, and that's fine, right? So that's great for them. So I think it's a little bit, you know, it's a question of where that founder's at. I mean, for some folks, to some degree, myself included, the benefit of building something can be the solitude because you enjoy it, right? It's nice.
Yeah.
So I think it's a question of understanding what you're trying to get out of that kind of connection, and therefore who the people are that you need to connect with, and then thinking about where you're going to find them. Are you going to find them in meetups and groups? Are you going to find them in your professional network? Are you going to find them in your social network? You know, it's honestly the same as looking for customers. What's your profile? Where do they hang out? How do you talk to them? But I think it really depends on where you are, right? If you're in an environment like Seattle, you have no excuse. It's very, very easy. Like, you throw a rock and you hit another entrepreneur. I mean, don't do that. They've got enough on their plates. But you know, find a social group, go hang out. There's so many virtual ones now. That's the other thing I would look at. If you're not in an area with a lot of founders, find a virtual group, find a Slack group. There's tons of these communities. You can literally Google it. When you bring on advisors and mentors, ask them if they know of any. Make it clear that this is something you're looking for. Be open about it. Somebody will refer you. You will find a group. It's really not that hard. And then when you find the group, contribute to the group. This is something I'm struggling with myself. Passive. People notice, people read it. They might not be engaging. Only the group creator will be creating content, but people are reading it. If you engage, I've had some really interesting conversations lately, and potentially some investments in SPVs and my upcoming syndicate. Potential LPs show up because of interesting conversations coming out of contributions in groups. Yeah. You never know who's reading. You never know what the opportunity could be. Like, get your voice out there, be heard, get people looking at you, honestly. Even if you're an introvert, do it anyway.
Because I was talking to Murph about this. I was like, you know, I feel like networking in the startup world is just like, you know, how you want to go pick up, you know, a girl or a significant other. You just got to shoot your shot and hope for the best. And it's like, you know, it's
a friend of mine actually just said something really similar. So a friend of mine just said something really similar to me the other day, and I was like, yes. I mean, it is. It's building relationships, ultimately, is what it comes down to, in all honesty. And building, whether those are romantic relationships, professional relationships, friendships, you know, it's all, there are a lot of those elements, even at an organizational, not an individual level, a lot of those elements are just consistent. We're all human, right?
Yeah. I mean, like building on top of some other things that you were talking about, you know, being a giver. I feel like a lot of people kind of underestimate how much value it may come. Like, in the moment, you may not be getting, you know, you might not be gaining a lot, but later on, you can be able to get a lot out of it. And I feel like it's just being a giver is a very fundamental thing that I feel like can go a long way, and it can have compound interest later down the line. Ryan, you wanna wrap this one up? We're gonna wrap it up. We went a little over time. So
thank you so much, Levi. Yeah, Levi. Thank you so much for hanging out with us.
Yeah, how can people find you? Thank you so much again. Yeah,
Levi Reed on LinkedIn. Yeah, and then I've got a blog sort of that I update sporadically on Medium. I think it's Medium at LV Reed, if I remember correctly.
Okay, Medium.
But it's also it's linked. Yeah, at LV Reed. That's it. Medium.com/@LV Reed. But it's linked on my LinkedIn as well.
Perfect.
It's mostly
we'll
just
do
me
that.
ranting about stuff.
We'll put it in the description, your LinkedIn and all that. I know you got some gems out there. Not some, you got a lot of gems out there, and that could really put people on. So go follow Levi Reed on LinkedIn and follow his Medium.
That was episode 3. Hope you guys got to learn some game from Levi Reed about product market fit, some things all AI related, and anything else about mental health in this game. He was super fun for me and Ak to talk to, and we hope you guys enjoyed it just as much as we did. Till next time, we'll see y'all later.
Peace.